From underwater data cables to old power transformers, the energy systems that keep our world running are facing more and more threats. Countries are now looking at new technologies to make their infrastructure stronger. But is there really a link between climate and security? And with this new reality in mind, could protecting national security be the key to finally speeding up the shift to clean energy? To unpack this urgent and complex topic, I'm joined by Austin Wood, investment manager at Set Ventures, one of Europe's most respected climate tech funds with a focus on digital energy innovation. Before becoming a VC, Austin was an early employee at Wallbox, the Spanish EV charging company that he helped scale from 50 employees to 1,400 and led their IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. Austin has also advised entrepreneurs across emerging markets through Endeavor. So when it comes to building high-growth climate tech companies and spotting the next wave, Austin knows what he's talking about. In this episode, we explore why energy security is quickly becoming a central force in climate investing. We'll go behind the scene of Set's latest investment in Optics 11, a Dutch deeptech startup that's turning fiber optic cables into sensing systems, and we'll explore what it means for the future of energy systems. Hello and welcome to VCA2, your weekly podcast that helps you become a smarter impact investor and a better climate tech entrepreneur. Before we start, if you are on YouTube, please don't forget to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow. And if you're listening to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, don't forget to leave a 5-star review and a follow. Thank you for all of these that will do it. And let's dive in. And just to go back to that Wallbox story, how did you feel when you went to the New York Stock Exchange and had the chance to, ring the bell over there? Like, what did it feel like to be there?
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. I hope that it's not going to be a once in a lifetime event, but it was really, really special to do that with the team and the CEO, Enrique and Jordi, the CFO. I think there's not too many companies from Europe that get to do that, let alone Spain. And so to be one of those really converted, Wallbox into a reference for the local as well as the European ecosystem. So was very, very fortunate and it was an amazing experience.
For sure. Well, I guess today's topic is really to talk about the energy transition and maybe a new play in the energy transition. But before we get there, I think it's important for me to understand Set Ventures as a VC firm. Where does it invest? What's the thesis? What's the size and the stage of your investment? Like, can you tell me more?
Yeah, absolutely. So SET is a Amsterdam-based venture capital fund that invests in digital energy technologies. So when I say digital energy technologies, it's not to say that we only invest in software. We also do invest in hardware. But when we invest in hardware, we're making sure that it is scalable. So we're looking at things that are connected, secured, automatable. The fund's been around since 2007. So I'd say one of the earliest energy tech funds in Europe. We're on the fourth fund now. It's a 200 million euro fund that invests in seed and Series A companies all around Europe. Usually, we're investing between, call it 1 to 6 million euros as an entry check, and we reserve up to 15 million euros per company over the life cycle of that investment. So we are very, very focused on the energy sector because our LPs come from the energy sector. So our LPs are DSOs, TSOs, large energy corporates, energy entrepreneurs, as well as traditional financial LPs. But our LPs very much help us on the identification of new opportunities and the vetting of new opportunities, as well as post-investment support.
Well, I guess if an entrepreneur is listening to this conversation, what makes a climate startup, and specifically in the energy system, venture backable for you? It's not every company that should raise venture capital, definitely. So, what makes a great company for you, Austin?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we come at it with a very specific approach to the energy sector, right? So we're looking at what is driving meaningful change within our energy systems, and specifically what is going to help our energy systems decarbonize. So I think in general, I think one, because we're investing at the seed and Series A stages, a lot of times we're looking at the team. Have they founded a company before? Are they repeat entrepreneurs? And we're also looking at the market. So I think companies that really understand the market, the motivations for different purchasing decisions, they really vary stakeholder by stakeholder. So I think it's super important that entrepreneurs understand that, and then as well as healthy unit economics, is I think the name of the game nowadays. So um making sure that they're not just fully focused on growth, but striking that nice balance between growth and healthy unit economics.
Do you consider yourself an impact investor?
No, so I wouldn't say, well, so set technically, we are a Article 9 registered fund, and we do track our impact with every investment that we make. So we do set impact KPIs for each investment that we do. And we would like to measure that impact with each investment to ensure that, we're tracking, the company's performance. And we actually link about 50% of our carry, so of, the profit sharing of the fund, to the impact metrics. So we do tie some of our performance to the impact, but I'd not say that we're a traditional impact investor in the sense of, we're only investing in companies that are, you know, impacting people below the poverty line, or that live below the poverty line, or that are trying to only focus on kind of impact metrics. We very do much look at kind of the financial performance of the company. And we think that companies can have the biggest impact by becoming successful companies, right? So we look at, viable business models, high potential for growth. And we think that if you can get to a certain level of scale, then you'll inherently have an impact as well.
Definitely, I think it's one of my learnings after all of this conversation, which is like maybe it's better to actually have a smaller impact per product, but actually scale the company much larger and therefore impact much more people and much more products and everything. But I guess today's topic is security as a driving force for the energy transition. Quite a complex topic, but one of the reason why we're also meeting today is because you just announced a deal in that specific space. The company is called Optics 11. I guess, can you explain in a few words, what they do, in which market do they play? Like, what's the deal there?
So Optics 11 is a company based here in Amsterdam, and they specialize in developing and utilizing fiber optic sensing technology. So for those that don't know, and believe me, I was one of these people, fiber optic sensing technology is essentially listening with light. So the way it works is that you take a light, you send it through a fiber optic cable, so the cables that are delivering us internet from all around the world, and you listen by measuring how that light interacts with its surroundings. So you essentially can stick one of these sensors underneath a bridge, on the side of a machine, underneath the ocean, and then you're measuring how the light interacts, or passes through the cable, and then you can interpret that, to measure things like vibration, temperature, pressure, and one thing that we'll talk a lot about today, which is partial discharge. And yeah, just going a little bit more. So the company has really two main focuses. One is monitoring and detecting uh, any abnormalities on critical infrastructure related to energy. So think transformers, substations, and then also two, for monitoring subsea critical infrastructure and detecting threats, or detecting any type of abnormalities or faults in underwater cables, be it energy critical infrastructure, or fiber optic cables.
Super interesting. I think it's quite a deep engineering topic, but um, on this podcast, we talk a lot about the business model and the idea behind the business and how it works and how the economics work. Can you tell me a bit more on that front? Because as you were talking, it wasn't really obvious to me that who are the customers? Who's going to pay for that? Why would they pay for that? Like, what's the model there?
So there's kind of two parts to the business model. One is a hardware sale. So the company sells fiber optic sensing sensors, as well as what we call interrogators. Interrogators are the things that are allowing them to interpret this data that they're receiving from the sensors. So they will sell those, and then as they're selling into certain industries like energy, they actually have a recurring service fee as well. So there's a SaaS model plus a hardware sale. And then in terms of the customers, they're mainly selling into two different groups of customers. The first that they're selling to are kind of distributors of their technology, which would be like a Royal Smith. So Royal Smith is one of the largest manufacturers of transformers in the world, but they also have a servicing arm. So the first part, as Optics 11 is launching this partial discharge monitoring technology that they call OptDefender, they're selling OptDefender to the servicing arm of Royal Smith so they can deploy these units into the field. They're deploying these units to monitor the transformers for grid operators. So think TSOs, yeah, some of the larger TSOs around Europe. And then for the subsea product, they're selling these their products through different consortias. So the consortias are selling directly to navies around the world, but they're selling kind of in packages, right? So they're selling this fiber optic sensing technology, but they're also selling the stands that allow it to kind of stand up on its own underneath the water. They're also, they have to sell into the Navy with a handful of different products. So they do that with partners.
And I guess, if I were to try and replicate this exact same business, like, is it as easy just to plug a fiber optic cable somewhere, or like, what makes it special for this company? What makes it unique as a product?
Yeah, I think it would be quite hard to replicate. So the company has a patent portfolio of over 30 patents. They spent 10 years as an R&D company before launching these two products. The fiber optic sensing technology as a category is really interesting because it has a wide range of use cases. So you can monitor things like cracks and temperature changes in nuclear reactors or pressure differences for semiconductors. So you can really use it to measure extremely minute details within the different environments that you're interacting. But the secret sauce, call it, is in interpreting this data through the interrogators that the company has. And so on one hand, the company has a handful of different patents on the sensing side. So being able to deploy what they call multiplex sensors that allow them to measure different things. So think, with the same sensors, they can measure partial discharge, they can measure temperature, they can measure vibration, but then also in how they interpret that data so that they can deliver actionable insights.
And is it a drop-in mechanism, or like you can just like plug that fiber cable to any other cable undersea, for example? Or like, do you have to build everything from scratch? Like, how do they work?
Yeah, so you can take advantage of existing infrastructure. You do have to deploy the sensors. So a lot of the times, let's stick with the energy use case. You do have to go to a transformer and deploy between four and 32 sensors, depending on how precise and accurate that you want your readings to be. But the nice thing about it is then you can daisy chain the solution to read transformers that are up to 40 kilometers away. So you don't have to deploy an interrogator every, kilometer, every 2 kilometers. You can have one interrogator per 40 kilometers, which allows you to do really precise, but also long distance monitoring.
And I guess that makes it quite cost effective if you can do that for 40 kilometers all at once. Is that something that convinced you as a VC?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that convince us. The cost is definitely one of them. But the really cool thing about the technology is that it's completely passive. So it doesn't what that means is it doesn't need any local power. They're essentially just using the light that's sent from one end of the fiber all the way to the other end. And what this allows is that the technology is immune to electromagnetic interference. And so when you're doing regular sensing, so that use power. A lot of the times when you're dealing with high voltage assets, it's really hard to get a precise reading on things like power lines or radio waves because of the high voltage. And also, it's extremely sensitive, so you can localize the partial discharge up to the femtometer level, which I had no idea what that meant before, but it means, a millionth of a millionth of a micrometer. So extremely, extremely, um, and precise readings. Um, and then I think too, the nice thing is that you can deploy these in really remote, hazardous, or hard to reach areas. So whether that's deep underground and the cables that are there, whether that's under the in the ocean, and actually, Optics 11 has a sister company called Optics 11 Life that uses the same technology, but within the medical technology field. So in things like MRIs. So usually where you would try to deploy these types of sensing technologies, there's a lot of electromagnetic interference, but with Optics 11's technology, you don't have that.
I guess you mentioned the word partial discharge quite a few times already. I am not aware of what that is, I must say. So can you explain it for me?
Yeah, and believe me, I was working in electric vehicles before this, and still, this went right over my head. But partial discharge, you can think of it essentially like electrical leakage. Basically, there are these tiny sparks that occur within electrical equipment when they start to degrade. And these sparks, they start to permeate through the insulation when the insulation starts to fail. So over time, as these assets age, if there's a crack, if there's a bubble, if there's a weak spot, the electricity actually can jump through the insulation, but not all the way through. And this partial discharge, like this mini lightning bolt, actually kind of flashes within the equipment, which can actually lead to breakdowns and actually even fires or electrical failures. So some of these, transformer fires that we're seeing around Europe, or we don't know the exact causes, but we think that it might be caused by partial discharge.
And is that something that you can measure in any other manner? Can you see it? Can you hear it? Like, how can you like control it if you don't have that system?
Yeah, it's the tough part is that it's really hard to see or hear. You can measure it. A lot of times you need to send someone out into the field, take an oil sample of these transformers, bring it back to a lab, do the testing. And sorry, you have to shut down the transformer while you do that. So traditional detection methods can take 2, 3 months. Like I said, they require de-energizing the assets for 1 to 2 weeks. If there's a problem, then you have to take the transformer, send it into a lab. It can cost between 40 and 100K in terms of kind of fixing that asset. So the nice thing about Optics 11 is that it can be deployed in the field. You get a real-time reading, and you kind of get an action plan, as I mentioned.
Okay, you said quite a few things that are very interesting on the technology. But for me, I think it's important as well to understand what convinced you to invest, within the company. Obviously, you're a venture capitalist yourself. Um, so, I guess there are other variables beside the tech and beside the product, usually that convince you. So, what are these?
Yeah. Absolutely. For us, it was a combination of things. I think one, we were super impressed by the team. They have an extremely experienced CEO named Paul Hayden. Really strong executive team. They have this really comprehensive patent portfolio that's been developed over the course of 10 plus years. They're solving a problem that we think is quite underestimated and underserved. So, I mean, if you look at the landscape, we estimate that there's about 90,000 high voltage transformers across Europe, and about 40% of those are over 40 years old. At the same time, you have some of the largest transformer manufacturers in the world saying that they're not going to keep pace with the demand of these transformers. So you currently have lead times of transformers between 3 to 4 years. And so extending the useful life of our critical infrastructure has never been more important. Um, and so when you take that and then you pair it with the fact that traditional methods for partial discharge, like I said, can take between 2 months. They cost a ton of money. They require a very niche background and kind of niche knowledge of these assets. We see a huge and kind of underserved market. So of course, then you have the traditional things like really healthy unit economics, with the potential to have recurring revenues, as well as a really big potential for impact.
You mentioned the CEO's background. What did he do before? Where does he come from?
Yeah, so Paul, he's a serial entrepreneur. So he founded and led a company here called Behold. Um, it's an access control software company, and he basically grew it from nothing to over 100 employees before he sold it to Microsoft. He then went over to another company called Ultimaker, which he transformed from just a local startup into one of the global leaders for desktop 3D printing. And then he served there both as the chief product officer as well as a board member. So, and then the last part is he was part of Binder's growth, from just a couple million in ARR to 100 million in ARR, and then he exited the company for hundreds of millions in 2023.
Yeah, definitely a strong track record. But he's the CEO, he's not the founder, as per your words. I guess, did that play a role in why you invested now? Because you said the company has been running for a few years. I think you said something like 10 years, which is quite long and unusual for a seed and series A VC to come in, after 10 years of operation. Can you tell me what convinced you to invest now as opposed to 10 years ago or 5 years ago when they started?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the Paul was definitely is one of the key factors that caught our attention. And so, we had been aware of this company before, but they were previously focused on a couple, although they had a number of different use cases that they were pursuing, whether that was for MRI beds, like I mentioned, semiconductors, nuclear asset monitoring, critical infrastructure like bridges. So the nice thing about this technology is that it's has such a wide range of applications, but when you have that, you really need to focus. And so, essentially, the way the story was told to us is that the Dutch Navy approached Paul and said, "Hey, we really think there's a lot of potential with this technology. Would you be willing to take a look?" And so when Paul came into the company, he started looking at the different applications, looking at the different market sizes, and he saw that the two biggest opportunities, as well as the two most urgent needs, were um, in energy as well as subsea monitoring. So obviously the subsea monitoring piece came from the Navy, but then when you look at the landscape of the transformer manufacturing capacity, the aging workplace in the EU, as well as like kind of this legacy approach to doing partial discharge detection and monitoring, he saw a huge opportunity here as well. And so Paul really took the company, started to really focus it on just these two use cases, and that's where they are today.
I think that's a great advice for anyone else building a company right now, which is that because your technology applies to many markets that you have to solve for every market at a time, specifically at earlier stages. I think it's very important to focus on one or maximum two markets, do it super well, become the reference and the number one leader in that space, and then maybe expand. Because like 10 years of R&D is a very, very long time for a company. But I guess one last question on the company before we switch to more of the global context around security and energy. Uh, but I'm pretty sure they have competitors. Why are they better than competitors?
Yeah, so I mean, there are definitely companies out there that are doing some innovative things with fiber optic sensing. But we saw Optics 11 as the first mover when it came to using fiber optic sensing for partial discharge monitoring. And so, of course, as we do when we did our DD, we talked with a handful of different players in the market, and we saw a handful of companies that were doing kind of long range sensing. So whether that's distributed acoustic sensing or distributed temperature sensing, but no one really focused on kind of the localization and this highly precise part monitoring critical infrastructure. So we see them very much as a first mover in this segment of the market, and there's some great applications that come from just using fiber optic sensing in that sense. But then also, as I mentioned before, they have a patent portfolio of over 30 different patents. They've invested a ton of time, extensive time and resources into developing this technology. And then, they're able to do this over longer distances. Um, with more precision, as well as multiplexing. So, as I mentioned before, kind of combining different things that they're sensing for all in one sensor. So, sensing temperature, vibration, and partial discharge. And then I think the last thing that I mentioned also is that they've developed a really um, strong network of partners, whether that's their strategic partners and go-to-market partners like Royal Smith, the Dutch Navy, but also companies like NKT, NASA, Airbus. Definitely encourage you to go to the website because they're working with some really cool customers and partners.
I think something very special about this deal is the mechanics around the deal. Um, the deal was composed of multiple specialized investors, which is quite unusual. So, Set Ventures and two others, which I'll let you talk about in a minute. I wonder how that came together, and do you think that was beneficial?
Yeah, 100% beneficial. I think when you talk with Paul, he said that when he did this deal, uh, he wanted to add two new investors that had deep expertise in two areas. One of those areas was in defense, and then the other area was in energy. And so, um, we were very lucky to be able to participate, and I think kind of rest on our laurels a bit because, as I mentioned before, we've been investing in energy for 20 years, one of the stronger performing funds in energy in Europe, as well as we really demonstrated. I think we're able to demonstrate a lot of our value upfront in our due diligence process because we're able to connect Paul with some of our LPs who are DSOs, who are TSOs, who are energy corporates. So, like I mentioned before, they were helped us in the evaluation process of this of the company, but in that process as well, we showed Paul and the team that if we move forward with this transaction, then we're going to be able to add a lot of value as investors in the long run. So we're very fortunate that he chose us for that role. And then he also brought another defense or call it dual use focused fund that focuses on companies that have one defense application as well as a kind of broader use case. And that fund is called Join Capital.
It's great. It's great to see Europe, going together on such important topics. And I don't know if the other funds are from Europe, by the way. I should have double checked that before. But it's great to see specialized investors going into startups because I think they really add value. Although there is obviously like a place for everyone on the cap table generally. But and it's also great to hear that they had such a great traction that they were able to choose their investors. I think that's a bit of the dream for every entrepreneur is to be able to pick and choose who you want on your cap table and who's going to support you the most. Congrats to them. Um, Talking about maybe if we take a step back, obviously Optics 11 plays in the security, defense, energy market. Like those are very hot market, and they also solve for impact. And I guess for me today, I love to understand how that affects climate and the energy transition, because we obviously need a driver for the energy transition. We need something to drive us towards making that transition, even if it's costly. Uh, I guess maybe my question for you today, and that's very broad, but like, is security the new driver of the energy transition?
Yes. I think it is a definitely a new driver of the energy transition. I think we're starting to see that there's an increased emphasis on words like energy sovereignty, energy diplomacy, and just really securing critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure is now also including energy as well as things like fiber optic cables. So I do think that it is a big driver. When we used to talk about things like decentralized energy storage, right? This was very much only as it related to energy, but now it's starting to kind of weave its way into defense applications as well. So we kind of been joking internally that that defense might be giving a second life to all of these like dead climate technologies, where everyone's going around saying that climate tech is dead. Well, we think that actually the ones that are able to find kind of a second use case might be able to find that second wind.
Definitely, and I hope I really hope that is a second wave. I don't know if the rest is dead, to be honest. My
I don't
opinion
think
is
so
that
either,
it's
huh?
not.
But there's that
Mm.
whole narrative around climate tech is dead, which we also don't believe. But everything does have to evolve to stay relevant.
Do you think that we will see, similar to the green premium in that climate tech wave, do you think that we will see like a security or defense premium on the price? Meaning, for example, the ability for and the willingness from countries to pay more for a service because they can secure it locally and have the supply whenever they need it. Do you think that's something that will happen in the future? Or is it already happening, maybe?
It's a good question. I don't know. There's some people who have said that this is already starting to happen. It's already starting to get introduced into the market. We don't see it necessarily priced into the market today, but I definitely think it could be priced into the market in the future.
And do you think we've done great as venture capital in the past in trying to build the companies for that security slash energy market? I was reading an article before this episode that you actually sent me, which is called the New Dual Order. It mentioned something about investors being overly fixated on how energy is produced as opposed to how it's consumed. I wonder, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you can't have one without the other, right? So the fact that solar has decreased by, was it 95% or something like that over the past 20 years, battery prices are following a very similar trend now. This allows us to deploy these technologies at scale. And now we're starting to see kind of mass market adoption of solar, and we've crossed the chasm a little bit from early adopters into mass market. The conversation turns to consumption, and so I do think it's incredibly important, vital even to focus on how energy is being consumed because with the technologies that have been deployed recently or over the past couple of years, solar panels, batteries, heat pumps, they introduce a level of complexity, of volatility, strain, and congestion into a system that wasn't built to handle these things. So like, the grid is decentralized to a degree, but it's not an inherently decentralized system. And so, focusing on consumption allows us to introduce technologies or invest in technologies that are smart, flexible, and that ultimately give us a more resilient energy system.
It feels like Europe is doing so well on that topic. I don't know if it's the same in America, but it feels like Europe is maybe miles ahead on, the software and flexibility plays and like that whole idea of like how do we consume becomes more important and how do we connect all of the devices together becoming more important. It feels like Europe is doing so well. I don't know. What's your take on that? Are we doing better than other region of the world?
Yeah, I definitely think Europe has, traditionally been the reference for innovation in energy technologies around the world. Has some of the more innovative grid incentive schemes, pricing schemes. It seems like kind of innovation seems to spread from here. I'd say, I have to defend my home country a little bit, but because there is some really novel technologies coming out of places like Texas, for example. I'm not sure if you saw Base Power just raised 200 million, but the things that they're doing are really interesting as well. So I think luckily Europe has some more tailwinds from regulation and from the administrations around the region versus where I think the current administration in the United States is not necessarily fighting for deployment of renewable energy technologies.
Yeah, I would, I would support that opinion. But I guess to switch gears a little bit, uh, I wonder from a VC perspective, you obviously need to get money from your LPs. You are already on fund number four, probably already raising for fund number five or soon to be raising for fund number five. Do you see a shift in the LP's appetite for climate? Do they want to see something more like related to security, for example, or like what's your take there?
Yeah. So, we just closed Fund 4 in September of last year. So I think our partners are taking a fundraising break, a well-deserved fundraising break for at least a couple more months. But I think the nice thing about SET's thesis is that it's remained very constant in the almost 20 years that we've been around. So we've always kind of invested in this digital energy technologies, with the idea that the energy system should be decentralized, automated, connected, secured. And because of that, because that hasn't changed, luckily we also don't have to change our thesis in a lot of ways. We're just seeing more applications and more use cases of that thesis, right? So when we talk about, again, decentralization, security, these words we really were just using in the energy context before, but now we're seeing that there's even more kind of application layers in defense as well.
Look, we have one last section before the end of this episode. It's called the fire questions. You will have one or two sentences maximum. Let's try to stick to one to answer about 10 questions in the next 5 minutes. Are you ready for that?
Sure, let's do it.
So, what's the most underrated opportunity in the grid infrastructure today?
Fiber optic sensing technology. No, no. I think for us, we've been focusing a lot on financing tools. So, I think we're kind of at a point where we have had early adopters. We're still kind of crossing that chasm into mass adoption, and that we believe financing tools can play a really big piece in this transition.
And you could have said fiber optic sensing
Yeah,
technology.
okay, okay. I'll go quicker.
What's the hardest thing about backing deep tech startups?
I think the technical risk.
Interesting. What's a green flag when investing in an energy startup?
Um, a green flag, I would say, is that they understand the market, the stakeholders, and then also the exit landscape.
And a red flag?
Not understanding.
For sure. What's the most exciting technology that you're watching in the energy security market?
Yeah, we're really keeping our eye on cybersecurity technologies.
Is there a source of information that you watch out for in the energy market?
Yeah, I really like CTVC, as well as Latitude Media.
Really interesting. And I was lucky enough actually to be featured in one of the CTBC article, which was very much a good surprise. But let's continue. So, what excites you the most for the next 5 years of investing in climate?
Mm, I believe that we will see more climate tech unicorns coming out of Europe. So yeah, I think we're at the very early stages of investing, and in the future, in the next 5 years, we'll start to see another wave of unicorns.
Interesting. I will watch out for that and keep you updated.
Yeah.
What's one piece of advice for a founder building in the energy ecosystem?
Um, I would say, mm, uh, think about scalability. So think about scalability and also distribution channels. You don't always have to have the most advanced tech. Sometimes just being an extremely efficient executor and killing your go-to-market strategy is enough.
I think that applies to a lot of verticals in climate. What's an advice for someone that wants to invest in energy?
Understand the exit landscape.
I love that. If you were not a VC, what role would you play in the fight against climate change?
If I was not a VC, I think I would go back to the operating side. It's really fun building something.
What are the three most important things to be a successful impact VC?
Um, Impact VC is tough. I think from a VC, I know I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but understanding kind of exit landscape, um, finding the best people, and knowing how to support entrepreneurs.
Great. And if people want to reach out to you after this episode because they have a great startup that they would like to invest in, or they would collaborate with you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Austin Wood. Or you can reach out if you have a startup and you want to send your pitch deck, you can reach out to Austin Wood at setventures.com.
Great. And one last question for you today. Who's the next person that should be in your seat for an interview?
I think you should definitely interview Forward One. They were the team that introduced us to Optics 11. They've done some really amazing deals. They just exited SensorFact with us to ABB. They've done some really interesting deep tech investing around Europe.
Um, well, look, listeners, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Austin, this was a fantastic episode. Very technical, but I loved it. So thank you so much for walking us through, how security and energy transition are colliding into one single topic. If you want to learn more about Austin, I will put the link to his LinkedIn in the description, as well as Set Ventures website. Austin, one last word for the audience.
Thank you very much for having me. Go read about partial discharge.
Love that. Thank you so much, Austin.
Take care. Have a good one.